we were talking about dreams and how dreams are very meaningful. And so about 4 weeks into this group, this is the 8th session we've had now as a group. It's actually the 9th session, but the first night I was here alone because of what happened. I had the meeting before the meetup announcement went out. But anyway, so we'll bring you up to speed on dreams, okay? The principle of this group is that we're going to keep everybody up to speed all the time, and it's okay to come in anytime. And so about 4 weeks into the group, though, I learned that I would have to have a knee replacement. And so I had this dream, and at the time I was very excited about the fact that people were actually coming to this group. And so the dream went like this. I'm at a sort of a party of the group, and we're having a good time together. And then there comes a time that we're going to leave, and I go into the parking lot, and there's this big, long, white limousine. And the back door opens, and there's kind of like a throne inside the limousine. And everybody piles in, and I'm supposed to sit in the throne, but somebody says, well, where's Albert? And so I said, I don't know, let's find him. And over in the dark corner of this parking lot, I see a very dark truck, and it's Albert, and he's calling to me from the back of the truck, and there are Nazis that have thrown him into the truck, right? and so I go over there, and Albert looks out the truck, and he says, don't let them take me. And so I interpreted this dream as Albert being my knee, and my knee saying, don't let them take me, right? So we've had some fun joking about that dream over the last few weeks, okay? But here's where it gets really interesting. This morning, I had a meeting with my surgeon for the knee, and he cleared me for surgery, but meanwhile, I decided that, I'm doing all right now. And my wife went out and to Whole Foods and found ginger oil with arnica and cayenne. And she said, this is supposed to be good for knees. And I used it for a day and a half, and suddenly my knee felt good. I haven't been taking ibuprofen. All the inflammation went away. So these are remedies that mainly women came up with over thousands of years, long before we had doctors. And 400 years ago, I guess people who had a bad knee used this kind of stuff, and it worked all right. So anyway, I told him this dream, and he says, oh, I believe in those things. He said, one time one of my patients called me up 2 days before his surgery and said, doctor, I have to cancel. And he said, why? And patient says, well, I had a dream, and I dreamed I died on the operating table, and so I just can't do it. And Lou said, okay, fine. I understand these things happen. So he didn't have this knee surgery that day that he was going to. 1 week later, he had a massive heart attack, and the heart surgeon had to put a stent in his heart and other things. And so it may be that if he had had the knee surgery, he might have died on the operating table. And so anyway, then he did have the knee surgery a year later. But Lou says, if you have a dream that tells you something like that, you have to pay attention to it. And so that's sort of one of the teachings of this group, is that Dr. Jung said the dreams mean something. Okay, they're not about just the trash of the day. I mean, that's part of it, but your psyche is telling you things. That's the purpose of a dream, and you would do well to pay attention to it. And so that brings up the subject for the evening, which is mythology. We're into chapter 2, or the second section of this book, which is Man and His Symbols. And it really has a very, very broad overview of Dr. Jung's work for laymen. And it was based on a dream when he was near death, actually, in 1960 or early 61. He had a dream, and the dream was that he was in a big auditorium with lots of lay people in the audience, and he was explaining his psychology to lay people. And so he took that dream to mean that he ought to write something that average people could pick up and understand. And so he had this book put together. Only the first chapter is by him, okay? And we've just finished, after 2 months, covering the first chapter. But you'll pick up on that through other things as we go forward. But tonight we're going to start the second chapter and hopefully perhaps finish it for now, which is about mythology. And the significance of this is that one of the main things that Carl Jung did in his life was establish that we're all the same. Human beings are fundamentally all the same from a psychic point of view. And he did that by going back to the mythologies of the world and seeing that the same motifs, the same stories come up in every society and have come up in every society for as long as we've been emoting about these things. So even if you go back to the cave paintings in France, which now have been dated, I don't know, back to 35,000 years ago or something like that, there's a shaman on the wall of the cave, and things that religious personages that everybody in the world looks to one way or another were in those early men in 35,000 years ago. Then since then he spent 60 years writing about this stuff, putting it all together for everybody. And I went the longest time. I mean, I read this book in 1990 in 4-page increments over a year's time. And at the end of the year, I felt like I had a year's therapy, really, because it touched me deeply. So one thing led to another, but I realized that this was written for laymen. And so I stayed away from his actual work because I thought, well, I'm not a psychologist, and this is gonna be all clinical stuff, and I'm not gonna understand the clinical stuff, so I'm not gonna read his actual work. So I was reading works about him or about his oeuvre. And so one of the first ones I read was Women Who Run with the Wolves. And that led to what for me was the equivalent of Dr. Jung's Confrontation with the Unconscious. And what happened to me at that time was that I wanted to write a novel, and I didn't know what to write it about. And in 1962, I had been in Japan with my family, and we had a live-in housekeeper. And so one day I was talking to my father about Michiko-san, the live-in housekeeper, and he was explaining how she came to be our housekeeper. And he said, well, girls like this, when they come of age, come to Tokyo for 5 years to earn their dowry. quote unquote. Now, what does that mean? Okay, but that's how he put it. I was 15 years old at the time. So they come to Tokyo to earn their dowry. And so in 1993, then 30 years later, I'm thinking about what to write about. And I said, well, what if I write a novel about a girl like that going from that position to be the first Prime Minister of Japan, first woman Prime Minister of Japan, and what would that person's experiences be and be like? And once I had that idea, then this eminence who came to me as a vision, okay, a physical person, but somebody I could see, woke me up every day for 8 months at 6 a.m. and made me sit at my computer until I wrote 500 to 1,000 words. And during that time, I turned the monitor down very low, and I just put my hands on the keyboard, and I visioned the entire novel from beginning to end. But then I put it in a drawer for 20 years because parts of it turned out to be very serious erotica. No, I was 15 or 16 when my father had told me the girls came to Tokyo to earn their dowry. But then I went back to Tokyo between I went back to Tokyo between 1979 and 85. During that time, I was in business. I had quite a number of experiences during that period, so I am well versed on what goes on in Japanese business, let's put it that way. All of those experiences, essentially, from my perspective in terms of Jungian psychology, that book was the autobiography of my anima up till that day, okay, and up to the day that I wrote it. But it's not for the faint of heart. So anyway, we have a Dropbox for the group, and I have put all my ratings for free on there. However, caveat emptor, you're free to read the novel if you want to, but I'm not going to ask you about it. It's only there because I don't want people to think that I'm running this group to sell my books. Okay, and so all my books are there, both the ones I wrote under a pen name and the ones that I've written otherwise. But that is a kind of mythology, what I just told you. So what I was thinking was maybe we should go around the room and have everyone talk about mythology or some myth in their life. Anyway, my myth is that when I wrote that novel, that was my confrontation with the unconscious, like Dr. Jung's, which I didn't know at the time. I didn't know until the Red Book was published in 2009. And then when I started to read the Red Book and understand what Dr. Jung had experienced during that 5-year period, then I recognized my experience. And I said, oh my God, this is what happened to him too. But I didn't know what to do with it at the time because I hadn't read Dr. Jung directly. I now have. So anyway, I read this Women Who Ran with the Wolves, and in that book, there's a story called Vasilisa the Wise. And at the end of Vasilisa the Wise, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who's a Jungian analyst in Colorado, gave about a 40-page dissertation on women's individuation. And she describes 9 phases that women go through during individuation. And so I used that as a kind of template for the topics of my chapters in the novel, at least the first half of it. Then one thing leads to another. Well, let me give you another example. Another example is the myth of the Marine Corps. Okay, I served 23 years in the Marine Corps, 3 on active duty and 20 in reserve. The myths about the Marine Corps are they're these hard-jawed very tough, very muscular guys who go around saying "Rah!" all the time, and so on. And so that's a total myth, okay? Because I'm 5'8.5" now, but when when I was going to officer candidate school, I was 5'9.5", and I was in the taller part of the platoon. Most Marines are little guys. They're smaller than me. They're mighty mites. Yeah. And I have known in my lifetime very few Marines that are like this myth that has been sold in whatever Rambo and whatever other movies are around. Because for one thing, in my experience, those guys never get past lieutenant colonel, okay? Because, okay, you can have a guy that's gung-ho, that's going to go kill the enemy type thing, and with a K-bar in his teeth, that's a kind of knife in his teeth and that sort of stuff. But, you know, those guys don't plan very well. They're not very strategic. And so I never met a bird colonel who was like that. Most of them are more like Colin Powell than they are like that type. And I did know one who led the battle into Grenada for Ronald Reagan, okay, when the Marine Corps bravely overtook the island of Grenada along with a few platoon of soldiers and a couple platoons of Marines. And they dominated Grenada. Actually, it's not that funny because we did lose 4 Marines in that operation but not on the ground. They were 2 helicopters that were flying in formation, and they were flying in front of the president's house, and they turned and flew into a cliff. Those were the only combat deaths in the Grenada incident. But anyway, this guy, when I went to Command and Staff College, he was on the faculty, and so he told this very brave story about how they bravely took Grenada. But that's a myth, okay? So the gung-ho-ness and that sort of thing. Well, Jean Raffa, who is a Jungian writer that I often refer to, she said that, you know, her hero was the Lone Ranger. And when she was 10 years old, she had a dream. And in the dream, the Lone Ranger shot her. Okay. And it really shocked her. Okay. And then she suddenly thought, well, geez, maybe this guy isn't so good after all. She started to learn about the shadow.
Maybe you had a black hat instead of a white hat.
Well, I don't know, but anyway, I mean, she talks about it in one of her books, and you know, she still occasionally in some of her blog posts does mention this dream that was very influential on her.
Women Who Run with the Wolves is one of my dearest books, and to me it's true medicine. It's a path. I use it to uncover and guide to strength, power, intuition. Women as the warriors they're supposed to be, the strong, nurturing, but as well as strong. And also I want to say I read, as I told you, your novel, Mako, in its entirety. It's truly a fabulous piece of work. You're an excellent writer. You all should read it. It's quite, let's see, enlightening.
Especially for the sex therapist.
But But myths, I don't think about myths in my life unless this book by Estes.
Well, that's a
Maybe
myth.
there's a lot of mythology in that. I truly love that book.
Well, that, in a way, that's your myth too, because that, in terms of your life, there's a mythological thing about that book. It's numinous to you.
But it's a shame she didn't publish it till I think 92 is when.
92 or
Because
3. Yeah.
I found it late in my life. I would have loved to have found it as a teenager
Yes.
to learn. To me, that's true female mythologic warrior ideal.
Yeah. Sure. And it's in all of us. I mean, the way I got the book was my mother, when it first came out, my mother gave it to my wife for Christmas. And I picked it up one day, having read this book, and started to read the introduction. And I didn't stop reading for 2 days. And every time Debbie came over and wanted the book, I said, "You can't have it until I'm finished." And I still keep it within my arm's length at my desk.
Me too. It's right on my bed table always.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful book, very powerful, and for men and women, because men have these archetypes in them as well. But we'll have to talk later on about whether we should read that book or Goddesses in Every Woman first, and Gods in Every Man, which are Jean Shinoda Boland's books. And because you were asking me about archetype, and they are those are tremendous books for describing the archetypes, because they're talking about the Greek gods, and primitive man didn't know what we know today about science and the world, and so the Greeks and earlier men were simply trying to describe what the powers were that were driving them at any given time, and these were the archetypes. And so when they described them, they came out and they became the gods, because these gods have power, they're within our psyche, and they drive us. But for shorthand, it's a kind of shorthand to say, oh, well, Herod made me do that, or Venus made me do that, or Mercury made me do this, whatever the god is. And so once you read these books and get all the details, then you can see yourself in these books, because yes, they're about gods, but they're only gods because that's what how primitive men knew how to describe them. But they're actually constellations of instinct and psychic energy in the unconscious, and they come out like gods, right? So we can talk about that. Dr. Jung mainly was aimed at the second half of life in his writing. Okay, he wasn't much interested in child psychology, although we had one session a few weeks ago where we talked about the movie A Dangerous Method, and the woman who's the lead in that, who's played by Keira Knightley excellently, is Sabine Spielrein. And Sabine Spielrein was one of the first child psychologists and one of the first writers on child psychology. And another person that was close to Jung is Erich Neumann, who left Germany in 1934 and went to Israel and lived there the rest of his life. But Erich Neumann both wrote a lot about child psychology, but he also wrote the book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And he wrote this book during World War II, when he was incommunicado from Dr. Jung, who couldn't write to him during that period. When he came back to Zurich in 1945 with the book, is the so-called Valkyries, who were the, I don't know, 8 or 10 women that were around Dr. Jung very closely.
They called themselves the Valkyries?
Well, that's how people amusingly call them. 8 or 10 women who became analysts and who were in the early days very protective of Dr. Jung's oeuvre, number one, but also his reputation and many other things. And they started the C.G. Jung Institute in 1948. When Neumann shows up with this book, the Valkyries said, we can't have the first publication of our institute be a 600-page book. It'll overwhelm everybody else, and we only want to publish pamphlets to begin with. So it wasn't the first publication, but it was like the second or third. and it's also a book that at some point in the life of this group I hope to discuss. It's an excellent book, excellent. We have to start somewhere. But Neumann, about half of that book is about mythology and going into mythological ideas in very great depth. But this is just a tiptoe across the mountaintops. It's not getting into any depth yet, but as soon as we finish this book, we're going to do other things that we're going to gradually get into greater and greater depth with this. Okay, but I don't want to scare people away right at the beginning. And this is only the 8th session. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing a lot of what went on in the previous sessions, I created a Facebook page called Jung for Laymen. And on that Facebook page, I've put video like this of every session. It's edited. It's called Jung for Laymen. Okay. Or you can also look up Carl Jung Deb Psychology Reading Group on YouTube, and they're all there also. Okay. So, and with each one, you can see a summary of what's in those videos. So if you want to look at them. Well, I use it in my life every day, I can assure you. I definitely do, and I very consciously do it now. In the old days, I didn't do it consciously, but nowadays I do.
See, I was trained as a physicist,
Mm-hmm.
and I work as an engineer in an engineering environment. And I've been very concerned for a long time that young people in the technical field are not really trained in ethics about what they're doing. And there was a kind of a tragic story that I experienced where an elderly lady had just lost her husband, and he had been working for the government building nuclear weapons, and he was having real regrets toward the end of his life that he had done this.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I liked about Dr. Jung was he really concentrates on this hyper-rationalism that we have in our culture, this utter lack of recognition of the irrational side.
Right.
And the pure rational kind of thinking is very dangerous.
It surely is.
And so,
As we see, I mean, as we see from our country now, has been very seriously divided, and investment bankers in New York who understand how all these computer programs work have managed to harvest the life savings of the baby boom and a couple of other generations after us. And
so it's a much deeper form of ethics than what's thrown out there. What's thrown out there is just Mickey Mouse ethics.
yeah,
Real
absolutely.
ethics
It has to
Yeah.
come from the individual.
yes, and has to involve the heart. It has
Right.
to involve
Right.
the subconscious.
Exactly. And I went to a business school where it was all statistics. And I had a finance professor who was married to a psychologist. And they didn't have anything in common. Talk about night and day in a marriage. And he said, we can describe everything with statistics. Well, no, you can't. We can describe American women, like the women in this room, statistically, but when you read the statistical analysis that describes that, it won't sound like you. Talk about a couple things here, because I found this discussion of the title of this is Discuss the Association Between the Shadow, Evil, and Creative Inspiration. And we've been talking about this at length the last few weeks. So, according to Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung said that everything in the unconscious is the shadow. Shadow is a mythical term for the unconscious. Our creative impulse or inspiration comes from the unconscious or shadow. The unconscious holds both good and bad qualities. Despite the term shadow, which implies darkness and is mostly associated with evil, it's the archetypal energies emerging in dreams and creative acts that facilitate the individuation process, a person's journey toward fulfillment and life purpose. Okay, that's what the individuation process is. And individuation was sort of the overarching thing that Dr. Jung talked about in his lifetime. And I actually put a lecture on the Jung for Layman page. It's now buried way down, but if you go down and look, you can find my hour-long discussion about individuation.